At the time that we recorded this episode with Emilie Kao, we were all together at Wilberforce Weekend back in May of this year. And at that time, she was working at the Heritage Foundation, but she has recently switched over to our friends at Alliance Defending Freedom. So I just wanted to clarify, because in our introduction, we actually say she works for the Heritage Foundation.
Today on the Strong Women podcast, we are honored to have our guest, Emilie Kao, who actually we are here live at Wilberforce Weekend Conference that Colson Center puts on once a year, and Emilie is one of the featured speakers this weekend. So it is a treat to have her. So I'll tell you a little bit about her, listeners, and then we will jump into her story. But she is the director of the Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society at the Heritage Foundation. She attended Harvard Law School, has worked at the United Nations, and has taught international human rights law at George Mason University. She is a member of the Supreme Court Bar and also the Bar Association of DC. So Emilie, thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks, Emilie. Okay, I'm curious what your business card looks like, though, because that was like a 5-minute title. You got to have abbreviations or something. But, okay, so we like to start with our guest where you started, because our childhood and growing up years are so influential into how God forms us. So where did you grow up, and did you grow up in a Christian home?
I did. So I was born in California. In Los Angeles area, and my parents became Christians right about the time that I was born, through a pretty amazing story with my grandmother who witnessed to them. So yes, I did grow up in a Christian home, and most of my childhood was in Maryland, where my parents moved to, until my parents moved back to China in 1986.
Wow. Okay, so your grandmother was a Christian and witnessed to which grandmother, your dad's mom or your mom's mom?
My mom's mom.
Okay. So how did she become a Christian, but your mom wasn't a Christian?
Well, it's a pretty amazing story. So my grandmother was born around the turn of the century in China, and she was raised, as many girls at that time were raised to, not really have an education. Right. So she only went to, a few years of elementary school before her education stopped. And then she got married very young and had children and, really never learned to read Chinese. Mm-hmm. So when the Communist Revolution happened, my grandfather took the family to Taiwan, and growing up, because my grandmother couldn't read, my mother always had to write notes for her, read things to her. So, all of my mom's life, my grandmother was not literate. And because of the hardship of moving from China to Taiwan and losing everything overnight, it brought a lot of stress to my grandparents' marriage, and it became very difficult. So my grandmother really began to seek God. I think she was really desperate, and she wanted to go to church. And she went to church for a little bit, but then my grandfather wouldn't allow her to go to church anymore. So then she was at home. My grandfather didn't want Christians to visit her at home either. And because she was illiterate, she couldn't read the Bible. So she really didn't have a way to learn about who God was. So she just kept crying out to God, show me who you are. And the Holy Spirit taught her how to read.
Whoa.
So through that miracle, she was able to read the Bible. And so she could read everything after that. And so because of that miracle, that was such a testimony to my parents. And so it was through that, seeing, the joy that she had, the peace that she had because of God's work in her life, as well as the miracle, that really made a profound impact on my parents. And that's how they became Christians.
What about your grandfather? How did he take all that?
My grandfather was very unhappy that my grandmother became a Christian because it sort of displaced him in her life. And so that brought a lot of friction to their marriage. But eventually, I think through my grandmother's, witness to him and her love for him, eventually on his deathbed, he did submit and profess Christ.
Wow. And is she still alive?
No, she passed away several years ago.
Okay.
But she was a huge influence in our lives because she lived with us as I was growing up. So she was probably the most profound Christian influence in my life.
Wow. So then how did you get from Taiwan to America?
So my parents came here for graduate school in the 1960s, and they met in graduate school, got married, and then they had me.
Okay. And then grandmother came over.
And then my grandmother came over, yes, and then my grandmother came over for a short trip at first, but then eventually she came to live with us.
Okay.
So growing up in your home, did you learn Chinese and English since you grew up in LA?
Well, actually, we
Maryland.
left LA very soon after I was born and moved to Maryland.
Okay.
So yes, because my grandmother lived with us and she didn't speak English, so I did grow up with that influence of, speaking Chinese with my grandmother and with my parents. So I did grow up speaking some Chinese, but it was when my parents moved our whole family to China in 1986 that I really became immersed in the Chinese language environment and really had to use it on a regular basis.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So how old were you when you moved to China?
So I was 14 when we moved to China.
Wow, that's a big change in a kind of pivotal time of life. Like 14, young teenager, you're starting to figure out your identity and who you are, and then you move to China. So how was that? How did that kind of shape you?
In a lot of ways. It was a very profound experience moving from America to China as, very much an American kid. At that point, I'd only lived in America, so I really didn't have any overseas experience. But because, my family is from China, we had extended family there. So it was a little bit easier for me, I think, to move into that environment. It was very eye-opening in so many ways, I think spiritually and intellectually. That at that point, communist China was still, very much what we think of with communism, the uniformity of everybody, having only everyone being the same and externally the same. Like everyone at that point was just riding bicycles. There were no private cars. When you would go to the stores, it was exactly what you would think of when you think of a communist store. There was kind of no options, no choices. Just everything was, very uniform because it's all centrally planned. That's what happens when you have a centrally planned economy. It just produces very, very limited choices, and there was always shortages. So I remember we, even though, we were foreigners, expatriates, we also had to get ration cards like other people to get, eggs and basic things. China was still very, very poor at that time. It was, the 80s. And of course, a very repressive government, where worship was banned unless you were in the three self-patriotic movements. So the house churches were very much underground. And, Christians, unfortunately, it's not that much better today. But, we met Christians who had been tortured for their faith, pastors who were imprisoned and separated from their families for decades. And so it just had such a huge impact on me, seeing the faithfulness in the face of persecution and just the humility of the witness of so many Chinese Christians that I met. And it made me realize that, when we talk about persecution in public policy circles a lot, and it's sort of abstract, but when you face persecution as an individual person, it really just comes down to your personal relationship with God, your faith in the Lord, that He is going to take you through whatever you're going to face. And it may not turn out with what the world would think of as a happy ending. There is going to be loss, and we met people who had lost so much in earthly terms, but they were willing to lose that for what they knew would be gain spiritually and eternally for the kingdom and for themselves.
Yeah. It's so, I didn't know this about you, but now knowing all that you do for religious liberty in your work, to realize, oh my gosh, you lived through that really gives you a perspective that so many of us in this country don't have at all, to live through even the experience of going to a communist grocery store. What you're saying, that's just outside of the realm of what most Americans we think of the grocery store, and it's just filled with food.
It's hard to imagine no choices.
I know.
In America.
I know. We are just so used to that.
Yeah.
So your parents purposely chose to go to this kind of environment. What was their motivation? Was it to witness to to non-believers there in China, to be a part of the church there?
Very much so. So again, they were inspired by my grandmothers. My grandmother, when China started to open up after President Nixon normalized relations, she wanted to go back and share the gospel with her family members in China. So she made several trips to China, and she was able to share the gospel with her family members and
How was she
her
received
village.
back?
People were very open to the gospel. I mean, I think that communism is so soul crushing, it's so deadening, and really destroys the life that is in us, that God has created. All of our creativity, individuality, all the beautiful things that we've been hearing about this weekend. So yes, people were very receptive to the message of God's love and God's grace, and not only for the people that my grandmother shared the gospel with. I mean, at that time, the church was growing very rapidly. I mean, it's still growing very rapidly. So many people heard the gospel through her and came to Christ.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm listening to an audiobook, and you might recognize the name of this guy, but it's The Heavenly Man. You recognize that? And it is so powerful of how this gentleman in China was persecuted, and his story is just incredible. Miracles all over the place. Mm-hmm. And then just the persistence of, I'm just doing this. So I'm wondering if you have any lessons from persecution that we need to know.
Definitely.
That's kind of a big question.
I definitely do.
Yeah.
So I'm often asked, why did I go from working on religious freedom in China, where there are life and death, issues, to working on religious freedom in America, mm-hmm. where we thankfully don't face life and death, mm-hmm. Crises. And the reason is because I have seen from working on religious freedom in many countries, the Middle East and China and Europe, that the decline of religious freedom happens gradually. It does not happen overnight. You don't immediately move to violent persecution. And so the stages that I've seen are the social marginalization of religious believers, to economic discrimination, to legal penalties, and then finally, in the last stage, there is physical persecution.
Right.
And I began to see several years ago, when I was at the Becket Fund for Religious Liberty, and that was around 2003, that what was happening in Western Europe with sexual orientation and gender identity ideology was leading to the social and economic and legal discrimination against Christians and people of other faiths who believe that we're created male and female created for each other. And then after the Obergefell versus Hodges decision redefining marriage at the Supreme Court, I just saw that sort of discrimination was on our doorstep in the United States, and that we really need to understand what religious freedom is in the United States. We can't take for granted the fact that it's in the Constitution and it's part of our founding story. We have to understand it deeply, and we have to be able to speak about it in the public square to people who don't share our beliefs. We have to be able to teach it to the next generation. And the state of religious freedom in America matters to the entire world, because America is still the leader of the entire world protecting international religious freedom. There's no other country in the world that has an International Religious Freedom Act passed by their legislature, an office in their foreign policy that is devoted to protecting international religious freedom, like our ambassador is. Americans have always been at the forefront of protecting religious freedom overseas because, of course, we're founded by people who were fleeing religious persecution. And so if America doesn't have that same grasp of the importance of religious freedom for people of all faiths at home, domestically, we're not going to be able to defend it in the way it should be defended overseas.
So how did you personally start to get into law? You're 14, so take us into how you decided. Was it in college that you started realizing I'm really passionate about this stuff, or I'm really interested in the law?
Well, no. I mean, after my experience in China and what happened in 1989 with Tiananmen Square, I think God put the issues of justice on my heart in a very strong way, and I wanted to become a journalist. So I pursued journalism. My dream was to become a foreign correspondent in the Middle East. I studied Arabic in college. I spent a couple of summers in the Middle East, in Egypt and Morocco. Wow. And then I got an internship, my dream internship at the New York Times when I was just in college. And I went there and I worked at the UN Bureau of the New York Times. And it was a good thing I did, because I realized I really wasn't cut out to be a journalist. And I was quite crestfallen, and I went back to college and I was really confused about what to do. Anyway,
what was it about that you didn't like about journalism?
I think the daily journalism was very hard for me, because you have to write very quickly on deadline and you have to wrap things up very quickly. And it was very hard for me to move on from one story to the next story day by day, because I would still be thinking about the story I was working on, and then I had to move to a new story, and I just wanted to look more in depth. And then after a while I realized I wanted to be on the front lines, doing the things that I thought I wanted to be writing about. I wanted to be an active participant in some of the battles that I was seeing. So anyway, God knew better, and He opened the door for me to go to law school. I was still really unsure about it, but God opened the door, and so I went to law school and was hoping to do international human rights work, and through a number of different steps, eventually I got there.
Yeah. Okay, I'm curious. I love how God uses people in our lives to kind of shape us or aim us towards different directions. Were there men and women along the way that have really influenced you?
Well, definitely Bob Fu, who is receiving the award tomorrow night. He was the first person who really showed me what was possible with defending religious freedom.
How did you get connected? We're in China. Did you get connected?
So it was in 2001. I was living in Geneva, Switzerland, working for the United Nations, attending an English-speaking expatriate church there that had a Chinese Bible study. And one day, Bob Fu walked into that Chinese Bible study. And at that time, he was just starting the China Aid Association. He was still in seminary at Westminster in Philadelphia. And, he just shared what his vision was, what China Aid was doing, helping the persecuted Christians in China, and people of other faiths. And I just really didn't know anybody who was trying to do that, to give voice to the religious believers in China at an international forum like the United Nations, because he was there to speak at the United Nations. And that was just so inspiring and really opened the path for me. So Bob was definitely the pioneer who paved the way for so many people and has always been a mentor to me.
And just for our listeners, Bob Fu is receiving an award here this weekend at the Wilberforce conference, but he is a Chinese pastor and has run the China Aid organization for 30 years, right? Isn't it almost 30 years? But anyway, so that's who we're talking about, just in case someone listening doesn't know who it is. Okay, so and so I was going to ask you about the United Nations, how you even got into working for the United Nations, and then now you're at Heritage Foundation. But anyway, so maybe tell us a little bit about your journey that way.
Sure. So I was at a corporate law firm right after law school, and then a friend from law school had another friend who was leaving a position at the United Nations, and they were looking for someone to fulfill that. So I went to the UN to work on the UN Compensation Commission, which was compensating victims from the first Gulf War. And so that's how I ended up in Geneva working at the United Nations, and that's where I really got my first exposure to international diplomacy and how human rights are defended at the United Nations.
Okay. And then when did the position at Heritage Foundation, where you are now, open up?
So that only started in 2017. So in between working at the UN and at the Heritage Foundation, I went to the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty and helped start their international advocacy work at the UN. And then after that, I went to the State Department and I worked in the Office of International Religious Freedom on religious freedom in China for 7 years. And then after that, I went to a law firm that defended religious freedom in the Middle East during the ISIS genocide. So we worked with a lot of Christians in the Middle East.
Wow. Okay, so then, all right, so how did you get connected with Jennifer? You got connected with Jennifer Paterson at the Heritage Foundation. And how long have you been at the Heritage Foundation?
So I've been at the Heritage Foundation since 2017.
Okay.
And I had worked with Roger Severino when I was at the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty. And Roger Severino was the director of the DeVos Center for Religion and Civil Society before I was. And then, of course, he was hired to become the director of the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services during the Trump administration. And so when he was leaving his position at the DeVos Center at Heritage, he reached out to me.
Okay, so now you have a project, The Promise to America's Children. And I always love to hear how projects start, because so many times it's like, you know, C.S. Lewis and the Inklings at a pub, or, you know, it like it's like a group of friends that are like, let's do something about this. How did it start? Like, was there a dinner conversation where you're like, this is not right? Who's with me?
Yeah, I would say there were multiple conversations.
Yeah.
The Promise to America's Children is a statement of 10 principles to protect children from early sexualization and destructive gender ideology. It's to protect their minds, their bodies, and their relationship with their parents in both culture and law. And it really emerged from conversations that we had at with Alliance Defending Freedom and the Family Policy Alliance. And our conversations about public policy were very much informed by what we were hearing from parents around the country. Parents around the country are, you know, concerned about comprehensive sexuality education in the schools. They're concerned about the influence of transgender ideology in culture and in education and in medicine. And, you know, we were just hearing about this on a regular basis.
Right.
And a lot of you know, tragic stories are happening around the country right now, with children being rushed into, you know, hormonal interventions and even surgeries on their bodies. And even those who don't go down their path, there's so much confusion now among children about, you know, can I, you know, choose my gender identity? Might I be trapped in the wrong body? And even those kids who are, you know, not having that confusion, they feel pressure to affirm the idea that, you know, you can change sex, and they feel, you know, pressure to hide their own beliefs that, you know, we're created male and female. So it was really listening to the concerns of parents around the country that led us to want to connect parents with lawmakers, and we just kind of came up with this set of principles that I think was trying to give voice to the concerns of parents. So
that is kind of your target audience with that, is parents, and really fighting for parents to keep the rights that we should have over our children. And do you see the role of that as really educating and alerting parents of things going on in law and culture, as far as things geared towards, or specifically targeting their kids?
Definitely parents are one audience.
Okay.
Also, I mean, there are a lot of concerned citizens who are not parents who are concerned.
Yeah.
And then there are a lot of lawmakers who are concerned. So it's really an effort to unite people from different, walks of life who share these concerns for children. And fortunately, that's really what has happened. We found that, it's a very simple concept. It's just a promise to America's children and just 10 principles. But it really has united people from around the country who share these concerns from different faith backgrounds, or no faith at all. It's united lawmakers with parents and concerned citizens. And I think it's helped to galvanize efforts to protect children in the law. So there have been a number of bills introduced both in the Congress and in the state legislatures to protect children from some of the things that are described in the promise, to protect their bodies from the surgical and hormonal interventions. So Arkansas just passed the first bill, and Texas is now considering a bill to protect children's bodies.
And what would that look like? Like what, in the bill, it's saying like, maybe there's more counseling required, or what? How does it protect?
So the SAFE Act in Arkansas is Save Adolescents from Experimentation Act, and it bans the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries on minors under 18 for treatment of gender dysphoria, because gender dysphoria is a mental disorder. It's not a physical problem. And so treating it should be focused on the mental disorder, not on changing the appearance of the body. So that's how it works.
So we've heard you talk about, Emily, in articles you've written and just in your speaking about the idea that words matter. And I wonder if you could talk about that, because we've talked on the podcast about the culture has hijacked some words and changed definitions. And so we've talked about that. And so I'd love to just hear your thoughts on this idea that words matter and that we should care about them. So maybe you could unpack that a little bit for us.
Yes, words definitely matter because words convey meaning. And right now, words are a major battleground for truth. So, I mean, obviously we're here, at the Wilberforce weekend where we're discussing the creation story and how, part of the creation story is that God gave names. He used words to describe his creation, and that gave meaning. And as human beings, we convey meaning to each other through our use of words. But what has happened with postmodernism is that postmodernism treats words as a battleground where words are always part of an effort to exert power. And so it's a very critical view of language. That's why it's called critical theory. And there's an effort from postmodernists to transform and deconstruct the meaning of words. So it's not an accident that, we're now told by gender theorists that we have to use preferred pronouns, that are not biologically accurate, that we, shouldn't be using words like boy, girl, man, woman, husband, wife, father, mother even, that is now being deconstructed, that we're told now that we should use words like, like I said in my talk, a birthing person instead of a mother, chest feeding instead of breastfeeding. This is a denial of a biological reality. And, as Christians, we understand it's a denial of the truth. And it's a denial of the spiritual reality as well. And so I think a lot of people feel scared by the intensity of the cancel culture right now, and they think on these issues like, preferred pronouns, using male and female, that it's, maybe it's an area where we should kind of compromise, and that it's the nice thing to do to use the terminology that is coming out of the gender theory movement. But to that I would say that the right thing to do is the nice thing to do. So using the correct language, male and female, mother and father, that is the truth of who we are. That conveys meaning, that we are different, that male and female are not interchangeable, that we're not fungible. Mothers and fathers are not interchangeable. They're unique. And we need to affirm that, and affirming the truth is the way to be nice, because the truth is what sets people free.
Right.
And we need to be able to model that to the next generation so that they grow up confident that they can speak the truth. Because once you start speaking things that you know are not true, you are influencing others, and you are speaking according to what is a falsehood and perpetuating that falsehood. So that is, a path that has consequences. And it's not something that is sort of, a side issue that's extraneous. It is really where the battleground is for truth.
With words.
With words.
Yeah. I think that's so important because it's so subtle, and it's so, just in the moment, it's way easier to just go along, not make a fuss, just go along with with what's being told. But I mean, I just really appreciate that advice. I'm wondering if you have any other advice for young women, because this podcast, we talk, a lot of our listeners are young women, and they're growing up in a very different time than the three of us have grown up in. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to them.
It is a very difficult time, but as we were talking about before, Christian women have faced many difficult times, whether it was Corrie ten Boom, or it was Mother Teresa, or it was the women of the Bible, Mary Magdalene, Esther. And so I guess my advice would be just to focus on, who God is, to cultivate that deep understanding of, the glory and the holiness of God, which you do through, reading your Bible, praying, and being in community. And it's through, I think, having that right understanding of God that we have that right understanding of ourselves. And that is so precious in this world, because what is happening in the culture is such a degradation of human dignity. I mean, we see that in so many ways that were talked about this weekend, from, the deconstruction of simply being a woman, erasing the idea of being a woman by saying that a man can identify as a woman and they are a woman, to what we see with abortion and assisted suicide, only valuing those people who we think are, healthy and have something to contribute to society. So many things about our culture really are marring the image of God in people. And so I think for young women today, knowing who God is how we know our own value as daughters of God, and that is really the most precious thing that we can offer to the world.
Yeah, I appreciate that reminder too, to all of us and our young listeners too, that there are women who have lived through difficult times and have done what you're talking about, have rooted their identity in God and who He is, and then they've been able to not only live through difficult things, but to have an impact and to make a difference. So I love that.
So read some of their biographies too. Yeah.
Know their stories too. Yeah. Okay. Emilie, we love to read, Sarah and I, and we have so many listeners that love to read. So we always like to ask our guests what books you're reading right now. So what's on your nightstand or in your suitcase that you packed for the trip? What books are you, or maybe just, do you do one book at a time?
I do multiple books at a time, which
that's most of us, I think.
Yeah, so I'm reading Gender Theory by Judith Butler, which I talked about, which is such an important book because that's really the most important book in gender theory, where she introduced the idea that gender and sex are simply social constructs, and therefore, gender is something that we perform, and even, sex and woman is not a stable category. It's something that, we perform, and that has such profound implications for all of society, but especially for women. So that is a very important book.
Do you have to have like a glass of wine or Tylenol or something when you read that?
I definitely try to read it in small chunks and then balance it with some other books.
Because Judith Butler, just to be clear, she's for transgender changes, and she's a doctor. Is that right? And
she's a professor at University of California, Berkeley.
Okay.
And probably the most influential living gender theorist and feminist.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so you balance her book that you're reading to know what theories are being pushed in culture and to students at the university and beyond. But so what were you going to say that you balance that book with?
So I balance that book with the Bible.
It's a good choice.
So I'm reading Abba's Child by Brendan Manning, and I think that it's really important for Christians, especially women, to understand how God views us, because so much of we get so many messages from the world that we are not enough. And I think women especially struggle with feeling like we're not enough because we have so much to live up to in today's world, whether it's external standards of beauty and appearance, or standards of, being intelligent, or standards of, being a wife and a mother, or whatever role, you have. The standards in our society are constantly shifting, impossibly high. Nobody can really live up to them. But one thing that's been comforting about reading that book is just the reminder that when you know that you are loved by God, you don't need to be enough, because God's love is enough.
And that's good news.
And that is good news.
Yeah. That's good. Okay, last question. If you could have coffee with any woman from history, who would it be?
Well, it is hard to pick just one, but I've been watching The Chosen, and it's really given me such an appreciation of Mary Magdalene.
Yeah.
And the way that Jesus loved her, picked her out of the crowd, elevated her, transformed her life. And I just think it's such a beautiful relationship. So if I had to pick a woman, I think she's, one of the women who was closest to Jesus, and, saw him in a really unique way, as a healer, as, someone who lifted her up from a low position in society. And so I think if I had coffee with Mary Magdalene, it would be really fascinating to not only learn about her experience, but to see Jesus through her eyes.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. Yeah. I like that.
Well, thank you, Emilie, so much for joining us today. And I want to point our listeners to the Heritage Foundation website, because Emilie writes articles. Is it every week, Emilie? No, not every week. Okay. There's a lot of articles on there. And I love all the topic. You cover so many topics all under the umbrella of religious liberty and the law. And we need people like you to help those of us who can't keep up with all that's going on in the legislature, in the culture. And so we just appreciate your work and your spending time with us today. So thank you.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you.